Miss Marple Murder at the Livestock Auction. Welcome, dear listeners, to Cafe Tales. I'm your host, Ailey, and I want to begin by saying how truly grateful I am for each of you who chooses to spend your time here. It warms my heart to know that these stories bring comfort and joy to such a wonderful community of listeners. Preparing every mystery takes time and care, but seeing how much you enjoy them makes it all worthwhile. It means the world to me that our little community continues to grow, and I'm delighted that so many of you are part of it. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing. It helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more stories to enjoy together. Now let us step quietly into tonight's mystery. Chapter 1, Ring, Rattle, and the Gavel. The early June morning had settled into that particular rhythm that belonged to much Benham on market day, when the ancient town seemed to shake off its weekday drowsiness and pulse with the urgent business of buying and selling. Miss Jane Marple, making her way carefully across the cobbled yard with her friend Lady Bantry, paused to adjust her hat against the strengthening breeze that carried with it the mingled scents of hay, leather, and that indefinable essence of livestock that meant serious money was about to change hands. "Really, Jane? I don't see why you insist on coming to these dreadful cattle sales," Lady Bantry said, stepping delicately around a puddle that reflected the gray stone of the market buildings. The smell alone would put most sensible people off their lunch for a week. Miss Marple smiled, her gentle smile, and shifted her knitting bag to her other arm. "Oh, but my dear Dolly, there's something quite fascinating about watching people when they're intent on business. Human nature reveals itself so clearly when money's involved, don't you think?" The sale ring was already half full despite the early hour. Farmers in their best market clothes sat alongside dealers whose sharp eyes missed nothing, while the occasional gentleman buyer studied his catalog with the air of one who knew precisely what he was about. The Women's Institute ladies had established themselves at their customary table near the entrance, their tea urns gleaming, and their array of sandwiches and cakes arranged with military precision. "Well, since we're here," Lady Bantry said with resignation, "I suppose we might as well make ourselves useful. Mrs. Pike will have our heads if we don't. Do our bit for the Y stall." They made their way toward the familiar figure of Nora Pike, who was directing the placement of what appeared to be an enormous plate of rock cakes, with the authority of a general deploying troops. Miss Marple, Lady Bantry, Mrs. Pike's voice carried clearly over the growing hum of conversation. "How good of you to come. We're expecting quite a crowd today. What were the pedigree bulls this afternoon? I've brought extra tea, and Mrs. Henderson's contributed those jam tarts that went so well at the church fete." As they settled themselves behind the table, Miss Marple's keen eyes took in the scene before them. The sale ring itself was a marvel of practical engineering, its wooden barriers worn smooth by countless hands and shoulders, the sawdust thick on the ground to provide purchase for nervous hoofs. At the center, elevated on his rostrum like a conductor before his orchestra, stood the auctioneer. Wilfrid March was a man who commanded attention without effort. Perhaps 50 years old, with graying hair and shrewd blue eyes, he possessed that particular combination of authority and approachability that made him popular with the farming community. His voice, when he began the morning's business, carried clearly through the ring without seeming to strain. "Good morning, gentlemen, ladies. We'll start as usual with the calves, then move on to the fat cattle, with our pedigree bulls reserved for this afternoon, when those who appreciate quality will have had their lunch and be in a proper frame of mind to appreciate what we have to offer." A ripple of laughter greeted this sally, and Miss Marple noticed how March's easy manner seemed to put even the most nervous first-time buyers at their ease. She had observed him before at these sales, and had always been struck by his fairness in the ring. Unlike some auctioneers who seemed to favor the big dealers, March ensured that every bid was seen and acknowledged, whether it came from a prosperous gentleman farmer or a young man buying his first stock with carefully hoarded savings. "Keep your eyes on lot 23, March murmured quietly to his clerk. A neat young woman named Ivy Pern, who sat at a small table to his left, her pen poised over the official record book. The numbers look mucked about. Miss Marple's sharp ears caught this exchange, though she gave no sign of having heard it. Instead, she busied herself arranging the teacups, while her eyes took in the various figures moving about the ring and the pens beyond. There was Cyril No, the dealer, his sleek head turning this way and that as he assessed the stock, with the calculating gaze of one who made his living by knowing exactly what each animal was worth to the penny. His clothes were better than most in Thering, his manner smooth, but something about the way other dealers avoided catching his eye suggested that his reputation was not entirely savory. In the ring itself, Alf Cobb moved with the quiet confidence of a man who had spent his life working with cattle. His movements were economical, his rope work neat as a textbook illustration, and the animals responded to his presence with the trust that came from recognizing a true professional. Hedley Prow, the market manager, hovered near the gates with the oily solicitude of a man whose living depended on keeping everyone reasonably satisfied, while ensuring that the market's cut of each transaction was properly recorded and collected. His eyes darted constantly between the ring and the pens beyond, where the serious business of moving livestock created a constant undercurrent of controlled chaos. At the far end of the ring, Tom Blount stood with the solid patience of a successful farmer, his eyes on a particularly fine blue rattled bewlock that bore his mark. Everything about him suggested a man who knew his business and was content to let his stock speak for itself. Near the loading bay, Len Ford wrestled with a recalcitrant lorry, his hands already black with grease, and his sailor's vocabulary clearly audible even at this distance. He had the weathered look of a man who had seen service in the war and had settled into civilian life with a philosophical acceptance of one who had survived worse things than temperamental vehicles. "Look at that bell rope, Dolly," Miss Marple said quietly, nodding toward the rostrum. "Does something strike you as odd about it?" Lady Bantry squinted in the direction indicated. "It looks perfectly ordinary to me, Jane. What are you seeing that I'm not?" "The Polish," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully. "See how it gleams in that one patch, just where a hand might grip it, as if someone had been handling it recently with something on their fingers." "Perhaps Mr. March simply keeps his equipment well maintained," Lady Bantry suggested. But Miss Marple was already looking elsewhere. Her attention had been caught by the side gate, where the check line that held it in position seemed to have acquired a fresh white tail of binder twine, tucked somewhat untidily under a wisp of straw. It was the sort of detail that most people would overlook entirely, but Miss Marple had learned long ago that it was precisely such small inconsistencies that often proved most significant. In pen B12, a pedigree Hereford bull snorted and poured the ground with what seemed excessive energy for so early in the day. The animal's red and white markings were handsome enough, but there was something in its manner that suggested nervous energy rather than the placid temperament one might expect from well-bred stock. "That beast seems rather excitable," Miss Marple observed to Mrs. Pike, who was passing with a fresh pot of tea. "Oh, that's one of the pedigree bulls for this afternoon," Mrs. Pike replied. "Beautiful animal, but you're right about the temperament. Been snorting and carrying on since they penned him this morning. Perhaps the strange surroundings, you know how sensitive some of them can be." As the morning wore on and the sale found its rhythm, Miss Marple continued to observe with the detached interest of one who found human behavior endlessly fascinating. The bidding was brisk, the prices fair, and Wilfred March conducted proceedings with his usual skill and good humor. But something was not quite right. Call it intuition, or simply the accumulated wisdom of many years spent watching people, Miss Marple found herself increasingly alert to undercurrents she could not quite define. There was tension in the ring that had nothing to do with the normal excitement of a good sale, and she noticed that several of the regular attendees seemed unusually watchful. As the clock on the market hall struck 2, and March prepared to call the afternoon session, Miss Marple settled back in her chair with her knitting, and prepared to observe whatever drama might unfold. In her experience, when people gathered together with money at stake and reputations to be made or lost, it was seldom long before human nature revealed its true colors. Chapter 2. Sold at 2:30. The afternoon session began with the measured deliberation that marked all of Wilfrid March's proceedings. The pens had been cleared of the morning's business, fresh sawdust scattered in therein, and the various officials had taken their positions with the practiced efficiency of a well-rehearsed company. Miss Marple had noticed that the atmosphere in the sale ring had subtly shifted since the lunch. Interval conversations were more subdued, and there was a watchfulness among the regular attendees that suggested important business was about to be conducted. The pedigree bulls represented serious money, and she observed that several gentlemen had appeared who had not been present during the morning session. "Lot 23, announced March from his rostrum, his voice carrying easily across the ring. "A fine bullock from Mr. Tom Blount's herd, gentle as a dog and carrying good weight." But even as the words left the auctioneer's mouth, Miss Marple noticed a curious thing. The animal being driven into the ring was not the placid, blue-rattled beast she had observed earlier in Tom Blount's pen, but rather the red and white Hereford bull that had been snorting and pouring in pen B12 throughout the morning. Tom Blount, standing near the rail with his catalogue, looked up sharply from his conversation with another farmer. His weathered face registered first confusion, then growing alarm, as he recognized that the animal in the ring was most decidedly not his gentle bullock. "Here now," he began, but his voice was lost in the general hum of conversation and the scraping of boots on wooden boards. As the audience settled in for what promised to be spirited bidding, the Hereford bull entered the ring with head high and nostrils flared, his movements sharp and unpredictable. Alf Cobb, positioned with his usual competence near the center of the ring, frowned slightly as he assessed the animal's temperament. This was not the docile creature the lot description hadled him to expect. "We'll start the bidding at $50, March announced, his gavel raised. The response was immediate, with several hands shooting up around the ring. Cyril Noses, Miss Marple noticed, was particularly active in his bidding, his pale eyes fixed intently on the Hereford. As the price climbed steadily, Miss Marple found her attention divided between the spirited auction and certain small details that seemed to demand notice. The bull's behavior was becoming increasingly agitated, and she thought she detected a yellowish smear around the animal's nostrils that had not been there when she had observed him earlier in his pen. March called, his voice rising with the excitement of competitive bidding. "Do I hear 80? The tension in the ring was palpable now. Farmers leaned forward in their seats. Dealers calculated rapidly, and the usual undercurrent of conversation had stilled to an expectant hush, broken only by the auctioneer's rhythmic chant and the occasional stamp or snort from the increasingly restive bull. 85, March announced, his eyes moving expertly around the ring to catch each bid. 90, do I hear 95? Lady Bantry clutched Miss Marple's arm. That animal looks dangerous, Jane. Surely they shouldn't continue with such an excitable beast in the ring. Miss Marple murmured something soothing, but her own attention was focused on the curious way the afternoon light caught that patch of fresh polish on the bell. There was something almost theatrical about its gleam, as if it were waiting for its moment to play a part in some carefully orchestrated drama. $100. The bidding had reached a level that drew murmurs of appreciation from the knowledgeable audience. March's gavel hovered above the block. Ash scanned the ring for any final offers. At that precise moment, Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught sight of Tom Blount, pushing his way urgently toward the ring rail, his face flushed with indignation and something approaching panic. But his progress was impeded by the crowd, and his voice raised in protest was lost in the general noise. "Fair warning," March called, the traditional phrase that indicated the bidding was about to close. The Hereford bull, as if sensing the moment of decision, threw up his head and let out a bellow that echoed around the wooden walls of the ring. Going once, going twice. The gavel descended toward the block with March's customary firmness. The sharp crack of wood against wood rang out clearly, immediately followed by the distinctive clang of the bell that signaled a completed sale. And in that same instant, as if the sound had triggered some carefully planned mechanism, the side gate of the ring swung open with violent force. The timing was so precise it seemed almost supernatural. The gate, which should have remained securely fastened by its check line, flew across the width of the ring with the speed and force of a battering ram. It caught Wilfred March behind the legs just as he leaned forward from his elevated rostrum, the momentum of his successful gavel stroke carrying him off balance. The auctioneer toppled from his perch with a cry of surprise that was lost in the sudden chaos that erupted throughout the ring. He struck the wooden barrier with a sickening thud that sent a chill through every observer, then lay motionless on the sawdust-covered floor. The Hereford bull, startled by the sudden motion and the crash of the falling gate, lunged forward with the wild-eyed fury of a beast that had been pushed beyond endurance. His massive head swung low, searching for a target for his rage, while his hooves churned the sawdust into a dangerous maelstrom. Alf Cobb, displaying the cool courage that marked a true professional, moved quickly to intercept the maddened animal. Using his hook with practiced skill, he managed to turn the bull's head away from where March lay crumpled against the ring barrier, though not without considerable risk to himself. "Get that gate closed," someone shouted, though in the confusion it was impossible to identify the speaker. Men scrambled to wrestle the swinging barrier back into position, while others climbed the ring rails to safety. Dr. Haddock, who had been enjoying a quiet pipe outside the ring, came running at the first sounds of trouble. Heist's experienced hands moved swiftly over the fallen auctioneer's still form, checking for signs of life while the chaos continued around them. "Stand back, please," he commanded with the authority of long practice. "Give him air." Inspector Slack, who had been making his usual rounds of the market, arrived at an undignified run, his face red with exertion, and the beginnings of official concern. "What's all this, then? What's happened here?" "Gate failed," someone called out. Beast got spooked at the knockdown and jostled it loose. Poor Mr. March took the full force of it. Miss Marple, still seated at her tea table, but with every sense alert, watched the drama unfold with the detached observation of one who had learned to look beyond the obvious. While others focused on the immediate crisis, her eyes were noting details that might prove significant. The bull had indeed been extraordinarily agitated, far more so than even the most nervous animal should be in familiar surroundings. And there was something about that yellow smear around his nostrils that troubled her memory, though she could not immediately place the association. The gate had struck the rostrum edge with tremendous force, leaving a deep gouge in the seasoned wood that spoke eloquently of the violence of the impact. But gates, in Miss Marple's experience, did not generally swing open of their own accord, particularly not with such precise timing. Dr. Haddock's examination was swift, but thorough. When he finally looked up, his expression was grave. "I'm afraid there's nothing to be done." The injury to the head and shoulders was severe. Death would have been instantaneous. A shocked silence fell over the ring. Wilfred March had been a popular figure in the community, known for his fairness and his genuine love of the livestock business. That he should meet his end in the very place where he had spent so many successful years seemed a cruel irony. Inspector Slack was already beginning his preliminary investigation, his notebook appearing with the speed of long practice. "Right then, I'll need statements from everyone who saw what happened. This looks like a straightforward accident, but we must follow proper procedures." As the crowd began to disperse and the official machinery of investigation ground into motion, Miss Marple remained quietly at her post, her knitting needles clicking steadily as she pondered the afternoon's events. In her long experience of human nature, she had learned to be suspicious of coincidences, particularly when they occurred with such theatrical precision. The gate had not merely failed. It had failed at exactly the right moment to achieve maximum effect, and that curious yellow stain around the bull's nostrils continued to trouble her. She was quite certain she had not imagined it, and equally certain that it had not been there earlier in the day. As the last of the crowd filtered away and the ancient market building settled back into their afternoon quietude, Miss Marple folded her knitting and prepared to take a closer look at the scene of what Inspector Slack had already dismissed as a tragic accident. But accidents in Miss Marple's experience rarely announce themselves with such dramatic flourishes. Chapter 3. Miss Marple Notices Mustard. The aftermath of tragedy has its own peculiar rhythm, Miss Marple reflected as she watched the crowd slowly thin around the sale ring. Some people lingered with a morbid fascination that draws spectators to accidents, while others hurried away as if proximity to sudden death might somehow prove contagious. The officials, of course, remained, going about their necessary business with the methodical thoroughness that such circumstances demanded. Lady Bantry had accepted a steadying cup of tea from Mrs. Pike and was holding forth to anyone who would listen about the shocking nature of modern livestock handling. In my father's day, she declared with the authority of one whose childhood memories had taken on the golden glow of absolute truth. Such things simply did not happen. Gates were properly maintained, and animals were handled by men who understood their business. Miss Marple murmured appropriate responses while her eyes continued their careful survey of the scene. Inspector Slack was interviewing witnesses with his characteristic blend of officiousness and impatience, his notebook growing thick with statements that would undoubtedly prove the obvious, that Wilfrid March had been the victim of an unfortunate accident involving farm machinery and an excitable animal. But Miss Marple had not lived through 70-odd years without developing a healthy skepticism about the obvious, particularly when it presented itself with such convenient completeness. Her attention was drawn to a small detail that seemed to have escaped official notice entirely. Near the base of the rostrum, partially hidden by the wooden supports, lay a greasy rag that appeared to have been dropped or discarded in haste. While Inspector Slack conducted his interviews and Dr. Haydock supervised the removal of the body, Miss Marple made her way quietly around the ring rail. Her movements, those of an elderly lady taking a gentle constitutional, rather than conducting an investigation. The rag, when she bent to examine it more closely, proved to be an ordinary piece of sacking of the sort that might be found in any farm building, but the sharp, distinctive scent that rose from its stained surface was anything but ordinary. Miss Marple's nose, trained by decades of domestic experience, identified it immediately and unmistakably. English mustard. Not the mild, creamy variety that graced plight tea tables, but the fierce nose-clearing preparation that farmers' wives made from dried powder, and which could bring tears to the eyes of the unwary. "How very curious," she murmured to herself, straightening carefully and glancing around to ensure that her small investigation had gone unnoticed. What possible legitimate reason could there be for a mustard-soaked rag to find its way to this particular spot at this particular time? Her next discovery came as she made her way slowly along the ring barrier, ostensibly admiring the solid craftsmanship of the wooden construction. On the gate cheek, precisely where a person might naturally place their hand when opening or adjusting the heavy barrier, was a small smear of the same unmistakable yellow that had caught her attention on the bull's nostrils. "Mustard on a bull's nose makes a charge, my dear," she said quietly to Lady Bantry, who had approached with another cup of tea and a determined expression that suggested she intended to remove her friend from what she clearly considered an wholesome scene. Though men won't own to it, of course. "Whatever are you talking about, Jane?" Lady Bantry demanded, her voice carrying the slight shrillness that indicated nerves stretched thin by the afternoon's events. "Mustard bulls, really? I think the shock has affected you more than you realize." Miss Marple accepted the tea with thanks and continued her gentle perambulation. The next anomaly that caught her attention was found on the hem of March's waistcoat, where a light dusting of blue rattle clung to the dark fabric. This was decidedly odd, since the animal that had been in the ring at the time of the accident had been marked with red rattle, not blue. She recalled Tom Blount Bullock, the gentle creature that should have been Lot 23 according to the official catalog, and how it had borne the distinctive blue marking that identified it as part of his herd. But that placid animal had never entered the ring at all, replaced by the agitated Hereford, whose red and white markings had been clearly visible to all. The final piece of this particular puzzle presented itself when she returned to the Women's Institute table, where Mrs. Pike was packing up the remaining refreshments with a brisk efficiency of one accustomed to clearing up after community events. "Such a terrible business," Mrs. Pike said, shaking her head as she wrapped the unsold sandwiches in grease-proof paper. "Poor Mr. March, and him always so careful about safety in the ring. I can't think how such a thing could happen." Miss Marple helped arrange the remaining crockery, her movements automatic, as her mind processed the day's observations. "Mrs. Pike," she said casually, "didn't you mention earlier that you had brought extra condiments today? I noticed the mustard pot seems rather depleted." Mrs. Pike paused in her packing, a slight frown creasing her practical features. "Now that you mention it, yes, I could have sworn I brought a full pot this morning, but it's nearly empty now, and one of the spoons is missing entirely. Most annoying, really, as it was part of the set the WI purchased specially for these events." "A spoon, you say?" Miss Marple's voice remained carefully neutral, though her pale blue eyes had sharpened with interest. "How very inconvenient. I don't suppose you noticed anyone taking a particular interest in the condiments." "Well, now that you ask, several of the gentlemen did come by during the lunch interval. You know how men are with their food, always wanting to pile on the mustard and pickles as if plain ham weren't good enough for them." Mrs. Pike's tone held the fond exasperation of one who had long experience of masculine eating habits. Mr. Nose was particularly liberal with it. "I remember said he liked his food with a bit of bite to it." Miss Marple filed this information away with the same careful attention she might give to a complex knitting pattern. Cyril No, the sleek dealer who had been so active in the bidding for the animal that should not have been in the ring at all. As the late afternoon sun slanted through the windows of the market hall, casting long shadows across the now empty ring, Miss Marple found herself constructing a mental picture of the day's events that bore little resemblance to the straightforward accident that Inspector Slack was so confidently documenting. The mustard-soaked rag suggested deliberate provocation of the bull, a cruel but effective method of ensuring that the normally manageable animal would react with explosive violence to any sudden stimulus. The yellow smear on the gate cheek indicated that whoever had handled the mechanism had transferred the substance from their fingers, while the blue rattle on March's clothing suggested that he had been in contact with Tom Blount's genuine Bullock at some point during the day. "Dolly," she said thoughtfully to Lady Bantry, who was gathering her handbag and gloves with the clear intention of departing before any further unpleasantness could occur. "Do you recall noticing whether the mustard pot at our table was full when we arrived this morning?" "Really, Jane, I can't say I paid the slightest attention to condiments," Lady Bantry replied with some asperity. "I was far too concerned with getting the rock cakes arranged properly and ensuring that we had sufficient tea for the expected crowd." "Why on earth does it matter?" "Oh, probably it doesn't matter at all," Miss Marple said gently, though her tone suggested quite the opposite. "It's just that I find myself wondering about the little domestic details. They so often tell us more than the grand gestures, don't you think?" As they finally prepared to leave the scene of the afternoon's tragedy, Miss Marple took one last look around the sale ring. The sawdust had been rad, the barrier secured, and the various pieces of equipment returned to their proper places. To the casual observer, it would soon appear that nothing more dramatic than the usual business of buying and selling livestock had taken place. But Miss Marple's experienced eye noted that someone had been remarkably thorough in their cleaning up. The greasy rag had vanished, though she was quite certain she had not imagined either its presence or its distinctive odor. The yellow smear on the gate cheek had been wiped away, and even the area around the rostrum showed signs of having been carefully attended to. Such thorough housekeeping might be commendable in ordinary circumstances, but in the wake of a suspicious death, it suggested something rather more sinister than a simple desire for tidiness. As she walked slowly across the cobbled yard toward Lady Bantry's waiting car, Miss Marple found herself thinking about mustard and rattle, about missing spoons and convenient accidents, and about the curious way that human nature revealed itself in the smallest domestic details. Someone had taken considerable care to ensure that Wilfrid March's death would appear to be nothing more than a tragic accident. But they had reckoned without the trained observation of an elderly lady, whose long experience of village life had taught her that the most innocent-appearing circumstances often concealed the most elaborate deceptions. Chapter 4. The Gate Latch with Soap. The following morning dawned with that peculiar clarity that sometimes follows dramatic events, as if the very air had been washed clean by the previous day's tragedy. Miss Marple, who had spent a restless night turning over the curious details she had observed at the market, arrived at Much Benham well before the usual opening time, ostensibly to retrieve a pair of gloves that Lady Bantry was convinced she had left behind in the confusion. The market wore the melancholy aspect of a theater after the final curtain, its cobblestones swept clean and its buildings locked and shuttered. The only signs of life were a few early workers preparing for the weekly sheep sale, their voices echoing hollowly in the morning quiet. Miss Marple made her way purposefully toward the sale ring, where yesterday's drama had unfolded with such fatal precision. The official investigation had concluded, Inspector Slack, having pronounced himself satisfied that the death was accidental, the result of mechanical failure, combined with an unfortunately aggressive animal. The case, as far as the law was concerned, was closed, but Miss Marple's curiosity was far from satisfied. Too many small details refused to arrange themselves into the neat pattern that Inspector Slack's conclusion required, and long experience had taught her that such anomalies rarely resolved themselves without closer examination. The side gate stood slightly ajar, its heavy wooden frame casting sharp shadows in the early morning light. Miss Marple approached it with a careful attention of one examining a piece of evidence, though to any casual observer she appeared to be simply an elderly lady taking a constitutional through the empty market. The check latch that should have held the gate securely in place bore unmistakable traces of recent tampering. Where one might expect to find the honest grime and wear of long use, there was instead a white greasy smear that caught the light with an almost suspicious gleam. Miss Marple withdrew a clean handkerchief from her handbag and gently touched the substance. Her fingers confirmed what her eyes had already suggested. This was not the honest tallow or grease that might legitimately be found on farm equipment, but rather something altogether more domestic in origin. Soap, plain household soap applied with sufficient liberality to ensure that any mechanism depending on friction or grip would fail at the crucial moment. The implications were unmistakable. Gates in livestock markets were designed to fail safely, if they failed at all. They were built by men who understood that animals and people might be injured if barriers gave way unexpectedly. For such a gate to swing with the violent force that had struck down Wilfrid March, its normal safety mechanisms would have had to be deliberately compromised. But the sabotage extended beyond the simple application of soap to critical moving parts. The check rope itself told a story that would have been clear to anyone familiar with proper knotwork. Where Alf Cobb's habitual cow hitch should have secured the rope with the reliability of decades of practice, there was instead a slippery trucker's half-hitch that would give way under pressure. More telling still was the fresh white tail of binder twine that protruded from beneath a wisp of straw near the latch mechanism. Miss Marple examined this carefully, noting how it had been snapped rather than cut, and how one end bore traces of that same soapy residue that had compromised the latch itself. The bell rope pulled on that sly knot, she murmured to herself, working out the mechanical sequence with the methodical precision of one solving a complex puzzle. The check would slip and the gate would fly. The beauty of the scheme from a criminal perspective was its apparent simplicity. The saboteur had relied on the natural sequence of events at a livestock auction. The fall of the hammer, the ringing of the bell, the moment of triumph or disappointment as lot was sold. These were the rhythms of market life, as predictable as the tides, and someone had turned them into the components of a murder weapon. Miss Marple straightened slowly, her mind already moving beyond the immediate mechanics of the crime to consider the more complex question of motive and opportunity. Whoever had rigged this elaborate trap possessed not only detailed knowledge of the market's operations, but also access to the ring during a period when such tampering could be accomplished unobserved. The morning was beginning to warm, and the first of the early workers had begun to take notice of her presence. Miss Marple smiled pleasantly at a young man who was arranging hurdles in one of the distant pens and began to make her way slowly around the perimeter of the ring, maintaining the appearance of casual interest while conducting a more systematic examination of the scene. Near the rostrum itself, she discovered additional evidence of careful preparation. The wooden supports showed fresh scratches where something had been attached and then removed, and there were small gouges in the sawdust that suggested the passage of rope or wire under considerable tension. But it was when she examined the bell rope itself that the full ingenuity of the murder plot became clear. The polished patch she had noticed the previous day was precisely positioned where hands might grip the rope during the normal course of an auction. But above this area, almost hidden by the decorative bunting that adorned the rostrum, were faint traces of the same soapy residue that had compromised the gate latch. Someone had prepared this crime with the thoroughness of an engineer and the patience of a spider. Every element had been carefully calculated to ensure that the normal, predictable actions of an experienced auctioneer would trigger the sequence that led to his death. The psychological insight required for such planning was perhaps more chilling than the mechanical skill. The murderer had understood not only how the equipment worked, but how Wilfred March worked, how his professional habits and personal characteristics could be turned against him. As she completed her circuit of theoring, Miss Marple reflected on the curious relationship between mechanical and human failure. The gate had been sabotaged, certainly, but the real weapon had been March's own professional competence, his reliability in following the established routines of his calling. A less experienced auctioneer might have missed the crucial timing. A less conscientious man might have allowed the lot to be sold without the traditional ceremony of hammer and bell. But Wilfred March had been a craftsman who took pride in doing things properly, and that very virtue had been turned into the instrument of his destruction. The sound of approaching voices reminded Miss Marple that the market would soon be coming to life for another day's business. She made her way back toward the main gate, with a satisfied air of one whose morning constitutional had proved both healthful and illuminating. Behind her, the evidence of murder lay concealed beneath the innocent appearance of farm equipment and market routine. But Miss Marple carried with her a clear understanding of how the crime had been accomplished, if not yet why it had been necessary. That question would require a deeper examination of the human dynamics that lay beneath the surface of market-day respectability. The kind of investigation that could only be conducted by someone who understood that the most revealing truths often lay hidden in the smallest domestic details. Chapter 5. 2 lock cards, 1 number. By the time Miss Marple returned to the market hall proper, the morning's activities were well underway. The sheep sale was proceeding with its customary blend of sharp-eyed assessment and good-natured banter, though she noticed that conversations tended to drift repeatedly back to the previous day's tragedy. Death, particularly sudden and violent death, possessed a magnetic quality that drew speculation like iron filings to a lodestone. She found Ivy Pern at her usual station behind the clerk's table, though the young woman's normally crisp efficiency seemed somewhat diminished by the weight of recent events. Dark circles beneath her eyes suggested a sleepless night, and her hands trembled slightly as she arranged the morning's paperwork. "Miss Pern," Miss Marple approached with the gentle diffidence of one mindful of another's grief. "I hope you don't think me presumptuous, but I wondered if there might be anything I could do to help. Yesterday must have been terribly distressing for you." Ivy looked up with a startled expression of someone whose thoughts had been elsewhere entirely. "Oh, Miss Marple, how kind of you. I'm managing well enough? Thank you, though it's been difficult to concentrate on the work." She gestured helplessly at the scattered papers before her. "Inspector Slack needed copies of all yesterday's documentation, and I'm afraid I've made rather a muddle of organizing everything." Miss Marple's eyes, trained by decades of domestic management, took in the apparent chaos with swift comprehension. Among the various sale catalogues, weighbridge tickets, and official forms, she could discern a pattern that spoke of careful record-keeping disrupted by extraordinary circumstances. "Perhaps I might help you sort through things," she offered. "I have some experience with paperwork, and sometimes a fresh pair of eyes can be useful." Grateful for any assistance, Ivy readily accepted the offer. As they worked together to restore order to the documentation, Miss Marple found herself in the ideal position to examine the records of the previous day's sales with the thoroughness that her growing suspicions demanded. The lot cards presented the first and most significant anomaly. According to the official catalog, Lot 23 should have been Tom Blount's gentle bullock, the blue-rattled creature that Miss Marple had observed in his pen that morning. The printed description was quite specific. Fat bullock, blue rattle, halter broken, gentle temperament, good weight. But nestled beneath this official card was a second document, handwritten in what appeared to be the same neat script that characterized all of Ivy's clerical work. This second card also bore the number 23, but its description told an entirely different story. Hereford Bull Red Rattle Pedigree Stock Penned B12. "My goodness," Miss Marple murmured, holding both cards up to the light. There seemed to be 2 entries for the same lot number. How very unusual. Ivy peered over her shoulder, her face flushing with embarrassment. "Oh dear, I can't think how that happened. Mr. March was always so particular about accuracy in the records. I must have made an error in the preparation, but Miss Marple's experienced eye had already noted several details that cast doubt on this simple explanation." The handwriting on the second card, while superficially similar to Evie's usual work, showed subtle differences in letter formation. The looped F and long-tailed R were particularly distinctive, executed with a flourish that was quite different from the young woman's typically restrained penmanship. More significantly, the paper itself bore different characteristics. Where the official cards were printed on standard market stationery, the second card had been written on a sheet that showed signs of having been prepared hastily, with ink blots and corrections that spoke of work done under pressure. "Miss Pern," Miss Marple said gently, "might I ask whether you recall anyone requesting changes to the lot cards yesterday? Perhaps someone asking for corrections or updates to the information." Evie's flush deepened, and her hands fidgeted nervously with her pen. "Well, there was some confusion about the numbers, I remember. Someone mentioned that there might be an error in the catalog and suggested that I prepare a corrected card just in case." "Someone?" Miss Marple's tone remained carefully neutral, though her attention had sharpened considerably. "Might you recall who it was that brought this to your attention?" "I believe it was Mr. No," Ivy replied reluctantly. "He said that Mr. March had noticed a discrepancy and wanted to ensure that everything was properly documented. He seemed to know exactly what changes were needed." Miss Marple filed this information away with the systematic precision of one assembling a complex puzzle. Cyril No, the sleek dealer who had been so active in bidding on the animal that should not have been in the ring at all. As they continued to sort through the paperwork, another significant anomaly emerged. Among the weighbridge slips, the official documentation that recorded the weight of animals sold was a ticket that showed the same distinctive handwriting characteristics as the second lot card. The weighbridge ticket was made out for lot 23, but the weight recorded was substantially higher than what Tom Blount's placid bullet could reasonably have carried. Moreover, the figure showed clear signs of alteration, with what appeared to be a 3 rubbed out and replaced with a 5. Executed with the same flourishing penmanship that had characterized the duplicate lot card. "This weighbridge slip," Miss Marple observed, studying the document with the attention of a scholar examining an ancient manuscript. "The writing appears to have been done in a hurry, as you might say. Was this also prepared at Mr. Nose's suggestion?" Ivy nodded miserably. He said there had been an error in the original weighing, and that Mr. March wanted it corrected before the sale began. "I should have questioned it more carefully, but he seemed so certain, and with all the morning's preparations." Her voice trailed off in obvious distress. Miss Marple patted the young woman's hand reassuringly. "My dear, you mustn't blame yourself. It's clear that you were simply trying to be helpful in a confusing situation." But privately, she was beginning to understand the scope of the deception that had been practiced on the previous day. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to ensure that the wrong animal would be in the ring at the crucial moment, and had used Evie's conscientious nature and professional trust to accomplish their ends. The picture that was emerging suggested planning of remarkable sophistication. The murderer had not only prepared the mechanical aspects of the crime with engineering precision, but had also manipulated the administrative systems of the market to create the exact circumstances required for their scheme to succeed. Tom Blount's gentle bullock had been effectively removed from the equation by the simple expedient of jamming his pen gate, while the Hereford bull from pen BB12 had been substituted through fraudulent paperwork that gave every appearance of official sanction. The weighbridge documentation had been altered to provide a plausible explanation for the discrepancy, while the duplicate lot card ensured that the substitution would appear to be an administrative correction rather than criminal deception. As Miss Marple helped Ivy restore the last of the documents to proper order, she reflected on the psychological portrait that was beginning to emerge. Their quarry was not merely technically competent, but possessed a thorough understanding of human nature and institutional procedures. They had known exactly how to exploit Ivy's professional conscientiousness, how to use the busy confusion of market day to mask their preparations, and how to turn the very systems designed to ensure accuracy and fairness into instruments of deception. Such knowledge suggested someone with intimate familiarity with market operations, someone who moved easily in this world and understood its rhythms and vulnerabilities. The question that remained was why anyone would go to such elaborate lengths to ensure the death of Wilfred March. And Miss Marple suspected that the answer lay not in the mechanical details of the crime, but in the complex web of business relationships and personal animosities that formed the invisible structure of market life. Chapter 6. Bell Rop and the Check Line. The afternoon found Miss Marple once again at the market, this time accompanied by a somewhat reluctant Lady Bantry, who had been persuaded that a return visit might help settle her nerves about the previous day's shocking events. The official business of the market proceeded with determined normalcy, as if the community had collectively decided that the best response to tragedy was a firm adherence to routine. Miss Marple, however, had not come to observe the sheep sales or to sample Mrs. Pike's refreshments. Her purpose was far more specific, and she moved with the quiet determination of one following a carefully constructed plan. The sale ring stood empty during the afternoon lull, its wooden barriers casting familiar shadows in the slanting sunlight. Miss Marple made her way slowly around its perimeter, ostensibly admiring the solid craftsmanship that had served the community for so many years, but actually conducting a meticulous examination of details that had been obscured by yesterday's chaos. What she discovered confirmed her growing understanding of the crime's mechanical sophistication. Along the inside of the ring rail, barely visible unless one knew precisely where to look, ran a line of scuff marks that told their own story. These were not the random scratches that might accumulate over years of normal use, but rather the deliberate scoring left by rope or wire under tension. The trail led from the gate's check mechanism around the inner curve of the rail to a point directly beneath the rostrum where a small metal ring had been discreetly fastened to the underside of the wooden structure. This pig ring, as it was commonly known, was typically used for securing temporary barriers or equipment. But its placement here suggested a far more sinister purpose. Miss Marple knelt carefully beside the rostrum, her movements those of an elderly lady adjusting a troublesome shoe, rather than conducting a criminal investigation. From this vantage point, she could see how a length of binder twine had been ingeniously rigged to connect the gate's check mechanism to the bellrop system above. The connection had been hidden beneath a decorative pennant that formed part of the market's traditional bunting. To the casual observer, the bright fabric provided nothing more than cheerful color to the proceedings. But Miss Marple's trained eye could discern how it had been positioned to conceal the crucial junction, where three separate elements of the murder mechanism came together. The binder twine itself was no longer present, having been removed during the cleanup that followed the tragedy, but its passage was clearly marked by the scuff mark she'd observed, and small fibers caught on splinters and rough edges provided mute testimony to its former presence. More significantly, the bell rope bore unmistakable evidence of recent tampering. The polished patch she had noted on the previous day was positioned exactly where hands would naturally grip the rope during the normal course of an auction. But above this point, almost hidden by the decorative mounting, were traces of the same soapy residue that had compromised the gate's latch mechanism. The implications were clear and chilling. When Wilfrid March had reached for the bell rope to signal the completion of Lot 23's sale, his grip would have been compromised by the soap, causing his hand to slip at the crucial moment. This seemingly minor detail had been calculated to ensure that the rope's movement would be both sudden and forceful, providing the mechanical advantage necessary to trigger the gate's violent swing. But the true genius of the scheme lay in its use of the market's own systems against itself. The bell rope was not merely a signal device, but an integral part of the auction's rhythm. March would have grasped it with the automatic precision of long practice, never suspecting that this familiar action had been transformed into the trigger for his own destruction. Miss Marple straightened slowly, her mind working through the sequence of events with methodical precision. The murderer had understood not only theme-mechanical principles involved, but also the human habits and institutional procedures that could be exploited to achieve their ends. The binder twine had been rigged to run from the soap, check mechanism along the concealed path beneath the rail up through the pig, ring and finally to the bell rope itself. When March's soaked hand slipped on the rope, the sudden jerk would have been transmitted through this hidden system directly to the gate's compromised latch. The timing had been perfect, coordinated with the precision of a Swiss timepiece. The hammers fall, the bell's intended ring, the gate swing, and the bull's charge had all occurred in the space of seconds, creating a chain reaction that appeared entirely accidental to anyone not aware of the hidden mechanisms at work. "Jane, what on earth are you doing down there?" Lady Bantry's voice carried a note of exasperation that suggested her patience was wearing thin. "People will think you've taken leave of your senses crawling about on the ground like that." Miss Marple accepted her friend's assistance in regaining her feet, brushing sawdust from her skirts with a matter-of-fact attention to detail that characterized all her actions. "Just examining the construction, my dear. Such solid workmanship deserves appreciation." But privately, she was marveling at the cold calculation that had gone into transforming this symbol of rural prosperity into an instrument of murder. Every element had been carefully selected and positioned to ensure maximum effect, while maintaining the appearance of tragic accident. The psychological insight required for such planning was perhaps more disturbing than the mechanical skill. The murderer had possessed not only detailed knowledge of the market's operations, but also an intimate understanding of Wilfrid March's professional habits and personal characteristics. They had known exactly how he would respond to the auction's climactic moment, how his trained reflexes would cause him to reach for the bell rope with practiced confidence, and how that very competence could be turned against him. As she made her way slowly back toward the main gate, Miss Marple reflected on the curious relationship between trust and betrayal that lay at the heart of this crime. March had died not in spite of his professional skill, but because of it. His reliability had been weaponized, his expertise transformed into vulnerability. The market community prided itself on the bonds of mutual respect and shared understanding that made such complex transactions possible. But someone had violated that trust in the most fundamental way, using their insider knowledge to commit what might well have been the perfect murder. That it had not been perfect was due only to the fact that they had reckoned without the patient observation of an elderly lady whose long experience of human nature had taught her to look beyond the obvious explanation for the revealing details that others might overlook. The mechanical elements of the crime were now clear in Miss Marple's mind. What remained was to understand the human motivation that had driven someone to such elaborate lengths to ensure Wilfrid March's death and to identify which member of the market community possessed both the knowledge and the ruthlessness necessary to conceive and execute such a plan. Chapter 7. Weybridge Ticket Weightbridge, at Much Better Market, occupied a position of considerable importance in the daily business of buying and selling livestock. Situated at the entrance to the main cattle pens, its solid iron platform and precise mechanical scales represented the difference between profit and loss for many transactions. Miss Marple had observed its operations with the idle curiosity of one who found all human activities worthy of attention. But she had never before considered it as a potential instrument of deception. Mrs. Pike, whom Miss Marple encountered distributing leaflets about the upcoming church fete, proved unexpectedly knowledgeable about the Weybridge's role in market operations. "My late husband worked for the County Weights and Measures Department," she explained with the pride of one whose family had been connected to official business. "He always said that accuracy in weighing was the foundation of honest trade." This observation prompted Miss Marple to request a closer examination of the Weybridge records, a request that Mrs. Pike was only too happy to facilitate. "The book should still be in the office," she said, leading the way across the yard. "They keep meticulous records of every animal that crosses those scales." The Weybridge office was a small, functional space dominated by a large ledger bound in cracked leather and reinforced with metal corners. Each page bore columns for date, lot number, owner, animal description, and weight, with entries made in various hands as different clerks had recorded the day's business over the months and years. Miss Marple turned to the page covering the previous day's tragic events, her finger tracing down the entries until she found lot 23. The record was immediately problematic, not merely because of what it contained, but because of how it had been altered. The original weight figure had been recorded as something ending in 3, but this had been carefully rubbed out and replaced with a 5. The alteration was skillfully done, but Miss Marple's experienced eye could detect the telltale signs of eraser beneath the fresh ink. More significantly, the handwriting of the correction showed the same distinctive flourishes she'd observed on the duplicate lot card, the looped F and long-tailed R that marked it as the work of the same hand. "Mrs. Pike?" Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "Do you happen to know what Tom Blount Bullock typically weighs? He's had that animal for some time, I believe." Mrs. Pike consulted a small notebook she produced from her handbag. "According to my records from the spring sale, that particular Bullock weighed just over 800 in weight. A fine animal, but not exceptionally large for its breed." The figure recorded in the Weybridge book, however, showed a weight nearly 1,000 weight higher than this previous measurement, even accounting for normal growth and good feeding. Such an increase was implausible for the time period involved. But if one considered the weight in relation to the Hereford bull that had actually appeared in Thering, the figure became entirely reasonable. Pedigree bulls commanded higher prices, and their greater size and weight were important factors in determining their value. Miss Marple's attention was caught by another document tucked between the pages of the Weybridge book. A purchase ticket initial CN for what appeared to be a pen of calves. The notation suggested that these animals were being held to keep him in the ring, a phrase that indicated the buyer intended to participate in additional lots during the day's sale. The handwriting on this purchase ticket bore the same characteristic flourishes as the altered Weybridge entry and the duplicate lot card. The pattern was becoming unmistakably clear. Someone with the initials CN had systematically manipulated the market's record-keeping systems to create the conditions necessary for their murderous scheme. I wonder, Miss Marple mused aloud, whether you might recall who was responsible for the Weybridge operations yesterday morning. It seems there was some confusion about the measurements. Mrs. Pike frowned slightly as she considered the question. Now that you mention it, there was some irregularity. Ivy Perrin mentioned that someone had requested corrections to several of the weight tickets, claiming that Mr. March had noticed discrepancies and wanted them properly documented. Someone, Miss Marple's tone remained carefully neutral, though her pulse had quickened with the familiar excitement of a puzzle piece falling into place. Mr. Nose, I believe, Mrs. Pike replied. He seemed quite concerned about accuracy, which was commendable, though perhaps a bit unusual given his his usual approach to such matters. This comment hung in the air with the weight of community knowledge carefully not expressed. In small communities, reputations were built and maintained through countless small observations and shared experiences, and it was clear that Cyril No's reputation was not entirely pristine. Miss Marple made a mental note to explore this aspect of local opinion more thoroughly. You mentioned that Mr. Nose's concern for accuracy was unusual. Might I ask what you meant by that? Mrs. Pike glanced around the empty office as if concerned about being overheard, then leaned forward conspiratorially. Well, there have been rumors over the years about some of the dealers' practices. Nothing that could be proven, you understand, but whispers about weights that didn't quite match, or animals that seemed different from their catalog descriptions. Ring fixing, you mean? Miss Marple prompted gently. Something of that sort, Mrs. Pike confirmed, with the reluctance of one who preferred not to speak ill of others, but felt compelled by honesty to acknowledge uncomfortable truths. Mr. March had been making it known that he intended to put a stop to such practices. He was quite firm about maintaining standards. You know, this revelation added a crucial dimension to Miss Marple's understanding of the crime's motivation. If Wilfred March had indeed been cracking down on fraudulent practices in the ring, someone whose livelihood depended on such deceptions would have had compelling reasons to want him removed. The Weybridge records provided clear evidence that systematic manipulation of the market's documentation had been taking place, and that this manipulation had been orchestrated by someone with detailed knowledge of the system's vulnerabilities. But the true significance of the altered weight ticket went beyond simple fraud. By ensuring that the Hereford bull's weight appeared plausible for Lot 23, the murderer had created a paper trail that would support their substitution of animals. Anyone investigating the discrepancy would find documentation that seemed to confirm the legitimacy of the transaction. As Miss Marple carefully returned the Weybridge book to its proper position, she reflected on the methodical nature of the crime she was uncovering. Each element had been carefully planned and executed to support the overall deception, with multiple layers of false documentation designed to obscure the truth. The murderer had understood that a successful crime required more than just the physical act of killing. It needed an entire framework of plausible explanation that would satisfy official investigation and community speculation alike. That framework had been constructed with the patience of an architect and the attention to detail of an accountant. But like all human constructions, it contained flaws visible to those who knew where to look. And Miss Marple was beginning to assemble a comprehensive picture of both the crime and the criminal who had conceived it. The question now was not so much who had committed the murder. The evidence was pointing clearly in one direction, but rather how to prove it to the satisfaction of Inspector Slack and the legal system that would ultimately be required to dispense justice. Chapter: Halter Knots in Drover's Hands. The art of rope work, Miss Marple had learned from her late father's naval service, was one of those practical skills that revealed character as surely as handwriting or speech patterns. Amon's knot spoke volumes about his training, his attention to detail, and his understanding of the forces he was attempting to control. It was with this knowledge that she approached Alf Cobb the following morning, finding him in his customary position near the cattle pens, preparing equipment for the day's work. Cobb looked up from his tasks with the patient courtesy of a man accustomed to answering questions from visitors who found market operations mysterious. His weathered hands continued their work as he spoke, demonstrating the unconscious competence that came from decades of practice. "Miss Marple, isn't it?" he said, touching his cap respectfully. "Terrible business yesterday, that was. Never seen anything like it in 30 years of working these rings." "Indeed, it was shocking," Miss Marple agreed, settling herself on a convenient bale of straw with the air of one prepared for an extended conversation. "I confess I find myself curious about the technical aspects of what happened. The gate mechanism particularly seemed to fail in such an unusual way." Cobb nodded grimly. "That's what puzzles me too. Those check ropes are designed to hold, you see. I've been tying them the same way since I was a lad, and never had one give way like that. Might I ask you to demonstrate?" Miss Marple requested with the diffidence of one making an unreasonable request. "I know it seems an odd thing to ask, but I find myself trying to understand how such equipment normally functions." With the obliging nature of a craftsman proud of his work, Cobb selected a length of rope and began to demonstrate his technique. His movements were economical and precise, each twist and turn executed with the confidence of long habit. "This is how we secure a halter for working with bulls," he explained, his hands moving swiftly through the familiar sequence. "Start with a cowhitch here, C-backed with a half-hitch for security. No slip to it, even with a beast pulling hard." Miss Marple observed the demonstration with close attention, noting how the finished knot presented a pattern of interlocking loops that would indeed hold firm under tension. The rope ends were properly secured. The working surfaces positioned to prevent slippage, and the overall structure spoke of competent seamanship applied to agricultural needs. "Most interesting," she murmured, "and I suppose all thea drovers use similar techniques." Cobb considered this question with the seriousness it deserved. "Well, now there's variation in the details, but the principles are much the same. We all learned from men who knew their business, and proper knots are proper knots, if you take my meaning." This observation prompted Miss Marple to make a request that clearly puzzled the deaver. "Mr. Cobb, I wonder if you might examine something for me. Yesterday, in all the confusion, I happened to notice the halter that had been used on the animal in pen 12. It seemed different somehow, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why." The halter in question had been retrieved from the evidence collected by Inspector Slack, but a word with the constable on duty had secured permission for this informal examination. When Cobb inspected the rope work, his expression immediately darkened. "This isn't right at all," he declared, his professional pride clearly offended. "Look here. It's a sailor's variant, what we'd call a slippery hitch, designed to come loose under pressure, not hold firm like it should." The implications were immediately apparent to Miss Marple, though she maintained her expression of polite interest. "A sailor's knot, you say? How curious. Would any of the regular market hands be likely to use such a technique?" Cobb shook his head emphatically. "Not likely at all. We're dealing with large animals that might panic, you see. The last thing you want is a knot that gives way when it's most needed. This is the sort of thing you might use on ship's rigging where you need quick release, but never with livestock. Miss Marple's attention was drawn to another significant detail: the bitter end of the rope, the free end that should have been clean and properly finished. Instead, bore traces of what appeared to be coal dust, the fine black powder that accumulated around loading areas where fuel was handled. This observation led her to consider the various market personnel who might have access to such materials. The most obvious candidate was Len Ford, the lorry driver, whose hands were perpetually blackened from his work with vehicles and machinery. "Tell me, Mr. Cobb," she said thoughtfully, "does Mr. Ford ever assist with the handling of animals? He seems to be primarily occupied with the mechanical aspects of transport." "Len's a good man," Cobb replied without hesitation, "but it keeps to his own line of work, trucks and loading mostly. Can't say I've ever seen him handle livestock directly, though he's always willing to lend a hand if needed." This testimony was significant for what it suggested about the logistics of the crime. Someone had deliberately prepared the Hereford's halter with a knot designed to fail, using techniques that pointed to specific knowledge and experience. But they had also attempted to implicate Ford by leaving traces of coal dust on the rope. The psychological portrait that emerged was of someone with detailed knowledge of multiple trades: livestock handling, rope work, and mechanical transport, but who was not necessarily expert in any of them. They had made elementary mistakes that would be immediately apparent to professionals like Cobb, while attempting to create false evidence that would mislead official investigation. Miss Marple's next observation concerned the clothing worn by various market participants. She had noticed that Cobb's work jacket bore traces of blue rattle, the marking paint that identified Tom Blount Bullock. This was entirely consistent with his claim to have been working with that animal during the morning preparation. However, when she diplomatically inquired about the activities of other market personnel, a different picture emerged. Cyril Nose, despite claiming to have spent the morning examining animals in the blue string, the section where Blount's Bullock was penned bore traces of red rattle on his shirt cuff. This physical evidence directly contradicted his stated movements and provided yet another link between the dealer and Baird marked Hereford bull that had been substituted for the intended lot. As Miss Marple prepared to leave Cobb to his work, she reflected on the accumulating evidence against Cyril Nose. The man had positioned himself at the center of every aspect of the crime's preparation: the fraudulent documentation, the mechanical sabotage, the animal substitution, and now the attempt to implicate an innocent party through planted evidence. But there was a recklessness to his methods that suggested either overconfidence or desperation. He had left a trail of physical and documentary evidence that pointed directly to his involvement, relying perhaps too heavily on the assumption that a death ruled accidental would receive only cursory investigation. The coal dust on the halter rope was particularly revealing, as it demonstrated an attempt to frame Lenford for the sabotage, while simultaneously revealing the perpetrator's ignorance of proper seamanship. A real sailor would never have made such elementary errors in knot work, and the attempt to suggest Ford's involvement only served to highlight the true perpetrator's unfamiliarity with naval techniques. As she made her way back across the market yard, Miss Marple found herself considering the curious relationship between competence and criminality that this case had revealed. The murderer had possessed sufficient knowledge to conceive and execute a complex crime, but had lacked the expertise to avoid leaving traces that would be obvious to anyone with professional training in the relevant fields. It was a reminder that criminal intelligence, however elaborate its schemes, was often undone by ignorance of the very details that honest practitioners took for granted. Chapter 9. Alibis in the tea tent at the Women's Institute tea tent had served as the unofficial nerve center of market day gossip for more years than anyone cared to remember. Its cheerful bunting and steaming urns created an atmosphere of domestic comfort that encouraged confidences and Miss Marple had long ago learned that more useful information could be gathered over a cup of tea and a slice of Victoria's sponge than through any amount of formal questioning. The day after her enlightening conversation with Alf Cobb, she positioned herself strategically at the familiar table, ostensibly occupied with the mundane task of counting teaspoons, but actually conducting the most delicate phase of her investigation. The art of extracting information from unwilling witnesses required a subtle touch, and Miss Marple had perfected techniques that would have impressed the most skilled diplomat. Mrs. Henderson, a formidable woman whose jam tarts had achieved legendary status throughout the county, proved to be a particularly valuable source of intelligence about the movements of various market participants during the crucial period before the tragedy. Such a shocking business, she declared, settling her considerable bulk into a folding chair, with an air of one prepared to hold forth on matters of public interest. Though I must say, there were signs that all was not well if one knew how to read them. Miss Marple made encouraging noises while arranging the tea service with meticulous care. Experience had taught her that the appearance of casual domestic activity often loosened tongues more effectively than direct questioning. Signs, she prompted gently, allowing just the right degree of curiosity to color her voice. Mrs. Henderson leaned forward conspiratorially. The behavior of certain individuals, my dear, take Mr. No, for instance. Normally, he barely acknowledges the Tatton's existence. Treats us ladies as if we were invisible furniture. But yesterday he made quite a point of visiting our condiment table. This intelligence sparked Miss Marple's immediate attention, though she was careful not to appear overly eager. The condiments? How unusual. I don't recall seeing him there myself. Oh yes, Mrs. Henderson continued with the satisfaction of one whose observations had proven significant. Just before the afternoon session began, he came bustling over, claiming he needed mustard for his ham sandwiches. More mustard than meat, the way he was carrying on about it. Quite out of character, if you ask me. The timing was significant, Miss Marple noted. The afternoon session had commenced at 2:30 precisely, with Lot 23 being the first animal into the ring. No's visit to the condiment table would have provided him with both the opportunity and the materials necessary for the final preparation of his murder weapon. I suppose he was simply feeling peckish, Miss Marple suggested mildly, though her mind was working rapidly through the implications of this revelation. Perhaps, Mrs. Henderson replied with the skepticism of one who had spent decades observing human behavior at close quarters. Though it struck me as odd that a man who'd shown no interest in our refreshments for 20 years should suddenly develop such enthusiasm for our mustard pot. Young Billy Thornton, who helped with the heavier work around the market and possessed the observational skills that often came with relative invisibility, provided another crucial piece of the temporal puzzle. Miss Marple had noticed him hovering near the tea tent, with a hopeful expression of one expecting charitable distribution of leftover cakes, and she had made sure to slip him a generous slice of Mrs. Pike's seed cake, along with her careful questions. Saw Mr. No fixing the bunting by Therastrum he offered between bites, his words somewhat muffled by cake, but perfectly comprehensible to Miss Marple's experienced ears. Just before Mr. March called the last bids on Lot 23, it was seemed mighty particular about getting it hung just right. The significance of this observation could hardly be overstated. The bunting that decorated the rostrum had served to conceal the crucial junction where the binder twine connected the gate mechanism to the bell rope system. No's solicitor's attention to its positioning provided clear evidence of his direct involvement in preparing the murder apparatus. Miss Marple filed this information away with the systematic precision of one assembling a complex legal case. The timeline was becoming increasingly clear. No had used the lunch interval to complete his preparations, visiting the condiment table to obtain the mustard necessary for provoking the bull, then positioning himself near the rostrum to make final adjustments to the concealed mechanism. Her investigation of the other potential suspects' alibis served primarily to confirm their innocence, though each provided useful corroboration of the overall sequence of events. Hedley Prow, the market manager, claimed to have been at the far gate, signaling to the devier during the critical moments. His story was supported by several witnesses who had observed his characteristic nervous pacing in that area, though Miss Marple noted that his positioning would have prevented him from observing Therastrum area where the final preparations were being made. Ivy Perrin's alibi was perhaps the most straightforward and verifiable. Multiple witnesses confirmed that she had remained at her clerical station throughout the afternoon, diligently recording the day's transactions with her customary attention to detail. Her clear handwriting in the official record book provided a precise timeline of the auction's progress, demonstrating conclusively that she had been occupied with legitimate duties during the period when the sabotage was being completed. Alf Cobb's movements were equally well documented, as his professional responsibilities required him to be visible in the ring throughout the proceedings. His positioning and actions had been observed by dozens of witnesses, and his prompt response to the bull's charge had probably prevented additional casualties. Lenford's alibi proved to be particularly robust, supported not only by multiple witnesses, but by physical evidence of his activities. A broken tire on one of the transport lorries had required his immediate attention, and his struggles with the recalcitrant machinery had been observed by what amounted to a small crowd of amused spectators. "That tire was giving him the devil's own time," chuckled one of the farmers Miss Marple interviewed. Language would have made a sailor blush, and him with his sleeves rolled up, showing those cold black hands of his. Must have been wrestling with that wheel for the better part of an hour. This testimony effectively eliminated Ford from consideration as the perpetrator, while simultaneously explaining the presence of coal dust that had been planted on the halter rope in an apparent attempt to implicate him. Tom Blount's whereabouts during the crucial period were confirmed by Lady Bantry herself, who recalled their conversation at the turn during the fatal moments. His distress at discovering that the wrong animal had been entered under his lot number had been genuine and immediate, ruling out any possibility of his complicity in the deception. As Miss Marple reviewed the accumulated evidence, she found herself impressed by the thoroughness of Nose's planning, even as she deplored its murderous intent. He had attempted to create an intricate web of false evidence and misdirection while establishing what appeared to be an unshakable alibi for himself, but like many criminals who believed themselves cleverer than their opponents, he had underestimated the power of systematic observation and logical analysis. His crime had been constructed with the mechanical precision of an engineer, but it had failed to account for the human element that would ultimately prove his undoing. The evidence against him was now overwhelming, ranging from physical traces on his clothing to documentary evidence of his fraudulent activities. What remained was the delicate task of presenting this information in a manner that would convince Inspector Slack to reopen what he had already dismissed as a case of accidental death. Chapter 10, Sail Ring, Bellgate and a Beast Provoked. The moment of revelation Miss Marple had long observed possessed its own particular rhythm. Like the climax of a well-constructed symphony, it required careful preparation, precise timing, and an audience capable of appreciating the full significance of what was about to be disclosed. She had therefore arranged for Inspector Slack, Lady Bantry, and the principal figures from the market community to gather in the sail ring on a quiet Thursday morning, ostensibly to discuss improvements to safety procedures. Thering stood empty in the morning light, its wooden barriers casting familiar shadows on the wrecked sawdust. To the casual observer, it appeared much as it had on countless market days, a simple structure designed for the practical business of livestock trading. But Miss Marple saw it now as the scene of an elaborate crime, each element carefully orchestrated to achieve a murderous purpose, while maintaining the appearance of tragic accident. Inspector Slack arrived with the barely concealed impatience of a busy man indulging an elderly lady's fancies. His notebook was conspicuously absent, and his manner suggested that he regarded this gathering as a formality to be endured rather than an investigation to be conducted. "Now then, Miss Marple," he began with patronizing good humor, "I understand you have some concerns about the accident that befell poor Mr. March. While I appreciate your civic spirit, I can assure you that our investigation was thorough and conclusive." Miss Marple smiled gently and took her position near the rostrum with the air of one about to deliver a familiar lecture. "Indeed, Inspector, I'm sure you conducted your inquiry with your usual efficiency. However, I wonder if you might indulge me in a small demonstration. I believe it may prove illuminating." What followed was a methodical reconstruction of the crime that Miss Marple had spent days analyzing and understanding. With Lady Bantry's assistance, she traced the path of the concealed binder twine from the gate's check mechanism around the inner curve of the ring rail to the pig ring beneath the rostrum. "You see," she explained with the patience of a school mistress, "someone had rigged this mechanism with considerable ingenuity. When Mr. March grasped the bell rope to signal the completion of the sale, the sudden movement was transmitted through this hidden system directly to the gate's latch." She demonstrated how the soap on the bell rope would have caused March's hand to slip, creating the forceful jerk necessary to trigger the gate's violent swing. The mechanical principles were simple enough, but their application had required detailed knowledge of both the equipment and March's professional habits. "Most interesting, I'm sure," Inspector Slack interjected with growing irritation. "But mechanical failure hardly constitutes evidence of murder. These old installations do break down, you know." Miss Marple nodded understandingly. "Quite so, Inspector. But consider this curious detail." She produced the mustard-soaked rag she'd discovered, its distinctive odor still unmistakable despite the passage of days. This was found near the rostrum immediately after the tragedy. English mustard applied to a bull's nostrils is a time-honored method of ensuring aggressive behavior. The assembled group stirred uneasily as the implications became clear. Cyril Nose, who had been maintaining a pose of polite attention, shifted nervously and avoided meeting anyone's gaze directly. Miss Marple continued her exposition with relentless logic, producing each piece of evidence in turn. The duplicate lot cards bearing No's distinctive handwriting, the altered Weybridge ticket with its telltale flourishes, the red rattle on his clothing that contradicted his claimed movements. The substitution of animals was accomplished through fraudulent documentation, she explained, displaying the forged papers with the air of a prosecutor presenting evidence. Mr. Nas used his knowledge of market procedures to ensure that the wrong animal would be in the ring at precisely the right moment. Inspector Slack's notebook had appeared with increasing rapidity as the weight of evidence accumulated. His expression had shifted from patronizing tolerance to professional interest and finally to the grim concentration of a man recognizing the significance of what he was hearing. But perhaps the most revealing evidence, Miss Marple continued, lies in the attempt to implicate an innocent party. She produced the halter rope with its deliberately faulty knot and coal dust contamination. This sailor's knot was designed to fail, but it was tied by someone unfamiliar with proper seamanship. The coal dust was planted to suggest Mr. Ford's involvement, but anyone familiar with naval procedures would recognize the knotwork as amateur Tom Blount, whose genuine bullock had been prevented from entering the ring by the simple expedient of jamming his pen gate with twine, nodded grimly. "I wondered how that gate came to be wedged so tight. Thought it was just bad luck at the time." The psychological portrait that emerged was of a man whose legitimate business practices had been threatened by March's increasing vigilance against fraud. No had built his prosperity on the systematic manipulation of weights, lot numbers, and animal substitutions. But the auctioneers' determination to clean up the market had threatened to destroy this profitable arrangement. Mr. March had made it known that he intended to stamp out ring-fixing, Miss Marple observed quietly. For someone whose livelihood depended on such practices, this represented an existential threat. Inspector Slack pulled back the bunting that concealed the junction. where the binder twine had been connected to the bell rope system. The soap residue on the rope was clearly visible, its presence inexplicable except as part of a deliberate sabotage scheme. The timing had to be perfect, Miss Marple continued. The hammers fall, the bells ring, the gates swing, and the bull's charge all occurred within seconds, creating a sequence that appeared entirely accidental to anyone unaware of the hidden mechanisms. Cyril's nose had grown increasingly pale during this exposition, his usual sleek confidence replaced by the trapped desperation of a cornered animal. When Inspector Slack finally approached him with handcuffs, he made one last attempt at bluster. "Marketcraft," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "Just marketcraft. A man fell." Miss Marple regarded him with something approaching pity. "Marketcraft ought to stop at knots and numbers, Mr. Nose, note at bells and gates." The arrest that followed was conducted with the quiet efficiency that marked Inspector Slack at his professional best. The evidence was overwhelming, the method clear, and the motive established beyond reasonable doubt. Later, as the official machinery of justice ground into motion, and the market community began the process of adjusting to the revelation of murder in their midst, Lady Bantry found herself standing with Miss Marple in the now quiet ring. "Beastly place to die," she observed with a shudder. Miss Marple folded her knitting with the satisfied air of one whose work was complete. "Beasts behave as they're prodded, my dear." People, too. Only with people. Ida's the little domestic things, soap, string, and a dab of mustard, that tell you who did the prodding. The ancient market buildings settled back into their accustomed quiet, but the events of that tragic Monday would be remembered and discussed for years to come. In the end, it had been Thesmalus details, the things that people noticed but didn't think important, that had revealed the truth behind what appeared to be a simple accident. Miss Marple gathered her belongings and prepared to leave, knowing that justice would now take its course through proper channels. The crime had been solved not through brilliant deduction, but through patient observation and the accumulated wisdom that came from understanding that human nature, in all its complexity, invariably revealed itself through the most mundane domestic details.